When I turned over in bed that night, my father-in-law's voice broke the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. "Are you cold?" he whispered, his breath warm against my cheek. What started as a storm outside had become a storm within, a single night that would unravel everything. How did we end up here, entangled in a secret too dangerous to speak? And when the truth comes out, will it destroy us both? Running from the memory, I kept returning to the fear within me. How did we? When I turned over in bed that night, his voice startled me. Low, rough, and a little too close. "Are you cold?" he asked, his breath warm against my ear. My pulse quickened, my heart hammering against my ribs, as though trying to warn me. I had no words, no way to respond. How had I ended up here, lying beside my father-in-law, feeling emotions I shouldn't even dare to name? It had started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. My mother-in-law had been called away for an urgent business trip. Her job often took her to far-off places for days or even weeks, and she thrived on the independence. But this time, something was different. She'd asked me to check in on my father-in-law during her absence. It wasn't as though he was helpless, far from it. He was in his late 50s, but fit and strong, always the stoic patriarch. Yet there was a vulnerability to him lately, a quietness that hinted at something unspoken. The higher hand had agreed without hesitation. After all, it wasn't unusual for me to stop by. My husband Richard had been married to me for nearly 5 years, and his family had always treated me warmly. But Richard was another story. Lately, he had been so preoccupied with work that our marriage had become a quiet, unacknowledged partnership. We lived together, shared meals, and went through the motions. But the passion had waned long ago. I hadn't realized how much I craved attention until that week. When I arrived at their house, the storm was already brewing. The dark skies and howling winds felt like a prelude to something larger. My father-in-law greeted me at the door with a warm smile, his gray-blue eyes lighting up in a way that felt almost intimate. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said, but there was a softness in his voice that betrayed his relief. "I don't mind," I replied, stepping inside and shaking off the rain. "Besides, someone has to make sure you're not living on takeout and beer all week." He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that made me smile despite myself. "I'm not completely useless, you know." Dinner that night was simple but comforting. We sat across from each other at the long oak dining table, the storm raging outside. The power flickered occasionally, but we barely noticed. We talked more than we had in years, slipping into a comfortable rhythm. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even my friends, questions Richard hadn't bothered with in months. "You know," he said, pouring us both another glass of wine, "I envy Richard in a way. He's so focused, so driven. I was never like that." "You've built a beautiful family," I said, hoping to steer the conversation away from Richard. It felt strange to talk about my husband with his father, especially when I felt this odd sense of being seen, really seen, for the first time in ages. He stared at me wistfully, perhaps forgetting. I nodded slightly. He nodded, swirling his wine. And yet, here I am, alone most nights, wondering if I'll spend the rest of my life in this empty house. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I looked down at my glass. The air between us felt heavier than it should have, charged with something I couldn't name. A clap of thunder jolted me from my thoughts, and we both laughed nervously. The storm worsened overnight, bringing with it a power outage that left the house shrouded in darkness. By morning, part of the roof had begun to leak, forcing us to confine ourselves to the safer rooms. It was his idea to share the master bedroom, just for practical reasons, he assured me. The guest room was directly beneath the leak, and the couch was hardly an option with the cold creeping in through the drafty windows. It made sense, it was logical, but as I lay there that first night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the awareness of his presence beside me. The bed was large enough that we weren't touching, but I could feel the heat of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was maddening. The next day, we tried to go about our routines as though nothing had changed. We made breakfast together, his hand brushing mine as he passed me a plate. I felt the spark before I saw his quick glance, his almost imperceptible hesitation before looking away. The next morning, the storm continued its relentless assault on the house. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain lashed against the windows with a force that made it seem as if the house itself was protesting. My father-in-law and I moved through the kitchen together, preparing breakfast. It felt oddly domestic, like we were filling the roles of a married couple, not in-laws left to weather a storm. The thought unsettled me, and yet I couldn't deny the warmth it brought. As he handed me a cup of coffee, our fingers brushed again. This time I looked up, catching his gaze. He didn't pull away immediately, and for a moment we just stood there, the weight of the silence between us pressed down, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Finally, he cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Sorry," he murmured, stepping back and running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Guess I'm a little out of sorts." I forced a smile, pretending I hadn't noticed the tension. "It's fine. The storm has everyone on edge." We sat at the kitchen table, our conversation light but punctuated by moments of awkwardness. He asked about Richard again, and I felt my chest tighten. The truth was, I didn't have much to say. Richard had been distant for months, his focus entirely consumed by his career. I told myself it was just a phase, but the silence between us at home felt heavier with each passing day. "He's working hard," I said finally, my voice hollow even to my own ears. "He always does," my father-in-law replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But sometimes I wonder if he knows what he's missing." I glanced up, startled by the edge in his voice. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as though weighing his words. "You're an incredible woman," he said softly. "Anyone with half a brain could see that. I hope he appreciates you." I didn't know what to say to that. His words shouldn't have meant as much as they did, but in that moment, they felt like water to a parched soul. I wanted to tell him that Richard did appreciate me, that our marriage was fine, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the rain streaking down the window. Later that day, the storm took a turn for the worse. Water began seeping through the cracks in the roof, forcing us to move most of the furniture into the dry parts of the house. By the time we finished, we were both drenched and exhausted. My father-in-law handed me a towel, his eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. "You should change out of those wet clothes," he said, his voice low. I nodded, my pulse quickening as I turned and headed to the bedroom. When I returned, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out at the rain. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he smiled, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," he said, patting the spot beside him. "Might as well make the best of it." I hesitated, but his smile was disarming. I sat down, the bed dipping slightly under our combined weight. We talked for hours, the storm raging outside while we shared stories and memories. He told me about his youth, about his dreams and regrets. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, sharing things I hadn't even told Richard. "It's strange," I said at one point, staring at the rain-soaked window. "I've never felt this disconnected before. From Richard, I mean." He didn't respond right away. His words hit too close to home, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I looked away, embarrassed by my reaction, but then I felt his hand on mine. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight that words couldn't. "You deserve to be noticed," he said softly, "to be loved the way you need." My heart raced, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Guilt, confusion, longing. They all tangled together, making it impossible to think clearly. I pulled my hand away, standing up abruptly. "I should check the kitchen," I said, my voice shaky. "Make sure there's no water leaking in there." He didn't stop me, but as I left the room, I felt his gaze following me. That night, the storm knocked out the power completely. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of a single candle on the bedside table. My father-in-law and I sat on opposite sides of the bed, the silence between us filled with unspoken tension. "Do you think it'll let up by morning?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," he replied, his tone equally soft. "But even if it doesn't, we'll get through it. Together." The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I didn't respond, my throat too tight to form words. Instead, I lay down, turning my back to him. The bed shifted slightly as he did the same, and for a while, we just lay there, the sound of the storm filling the room. But then, I felt it, his hand brushing against mine under the covers. It was the lightest of touches, almost accidental, but when I didn't pull away, he let his fingers linger, his touch tentative but deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my stomach. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't." "It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't. Not really. For the rest of the night, we stayed on our respective sides of the bed, the unspoken tension between us growing heavier with each passing moment. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead, and whether I had the strength to stop it. The next morning, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The rain poured harder, and the wind howled with a ferocity that rattled the windows. I stayed in the bedroom longer than usual, not ready to face my father-in-law after the tension of the previous night. My mind was a storm of its own, guilt clashing with a dangerous sense of exhilaration. I kept replaying the moment his fingers had brushed against mine, wondering what it meant, and, more alarmingly, why I hadn't pulled away. Eventually, hunger and practicality forced me downstairs. He was already in the kitchen, preparing coffee. His back was to me, but he must have sensed my presence, because he turned around, a tentative smile on his face. "Morning," he said, his voice warmer than it should have been. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light, as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't meet his eyes for long, afraid of what I might see there, or reveal in my own. We settled into a careful rhythm throughout the day, avoiding topics that might bring us too close to the edge. We focused on the storm, the house, and the mundane tasks that needed tending to. Yet, every interaction felt charged, every accidental touch or lingering glance feeding the tension between us. His hand, By the afternoon, the house began to feel suffocating. The relentless storm trapped us inside, and the close quarters only amplified the unspoken feelings hanging in the air. While moving some of the heavier furniture away from the leaking ceiling, we found ourselves standing closer than necessary. He reached past me to grab a chair, his arm brushing against mine. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I could tell he felt it too, from the way he froze, his hand still gripping the chair. He started, but whatever he was going to say died in his throat. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, standing in a dimly lit room, the sound of rain pounding against the roof like a warning. I stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should finish this," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Right." But the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew heavier, pressing down on us like the storm clouds overhead. That evening, after a quiet dinner, the power went out again. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering candles we'd scattered around earlier. We sat in the living room, the storm raging outside, while the silence between us grew unbearable. "I don't think I've thanked you properly," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "For what?" I asked, startled. "For being here," he said, his tone earnest. "I know you didn't have to. You could have stayed home with Richard, but you came, and it means more than you know." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I wanted to help," I said finally, though the words felt inadequate. "You've done more than help," he said, his gaze steady. "You've reminded me what it feels like to have someone care, to not feel invisible." His words cut through me like a knife. I felt my chest tighten, guilt and something else, a dangerous, thrilling warmth filling the space between us. The sound of my cry reached him. "You're not invisible," I said softly, my voice trembling. "At least, not to me." The room fell silent again, but the air was thick with unspoken words. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, the tension reached its breaking point. The bedroom felt smaller than it had the night before, the candlelight casting shadows that seemed to dance with the storm outside. I slipped under the covers, trying to ignore the way my heart pounded as he climbed in beside me. For a while we lay in silence, the space between us vast yet unbearably close. I thought he might have fallen asleep until I heard him whisper my name. "Is that you?" "Are you awake?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," I replied, barely louder than the rain outside. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, the words tumbling out as though he'd been holding them back for too long. "You've been on my mind all day." "Hell, longer than that." I turned toward him, my heart racing. "You can't say things like that." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I see the way Richard treats you, how he doesn't notice you the way he should. And it drives me crazy because you deserve so much more." "Theo," his words hit me like a tidal wave, bringing with them a flood of emotions I wasn't ready for. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Richard did care, but the truth was, I didn't know anymore. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and his eyes searching mine, I didn't want to push him away. "You don't know what you're saying," I whispered, though my resolve was already crumbling. "I do," he said, his voice firm. I know exactly what I'm saying, and I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. His hand reached for mine under the covers, his touch tentative but electric. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him hold it, the weight of his hand grounding me, even as my thoughts spiraled. "This can't happen," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he murmured, "but just for tonight, can we pretend? Can we forget everything else and just be here?" Ire settled, and the movement gentle as he softly swayed her. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence spoke for itself as we lay there, the space between us disappearing. His hand brushed my cheek, and I felt myself lean into his touch, my defenses crumbling under the weight of everything I'd been holding back. The kiss that followed was soft at first, hesitant, as though we were both testing the waters. But it didn't take long for it to deepen, the storm outside matching the storm within us. For a brief moment, nothing else mattered, not the guilt, not the consequences, just the overwhelming need to feel something, to be seen, to be wanted. By the time the sun rose the next morning, reality came crashing down. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily quiet. We avoided each other's gaze as we got ready for the day, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily between us. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have—" "Let's not talk about it," I said quickly, cutting him off. "It's done. It's over." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. What had happened between us wasn't something that could be erased so easily. It was a fracture, a crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew, and no matter how hard we tried to move on, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows. The quiet after the storm felt louder than the chaos itself. Every creak of the house, every faint sound outside seemed amplified, as though the world was conspiring to remind me of what had happened. I busied myself cleaning up the remnants of the storm damage, towels soaked with rainwater, furniture displaced in the chaos. But my mind was elsewhere. I could still feel his touch, his whispered words echoing in my ears. My father-in-law avoided me for most of the morning. He remained in the study, pretending to pore over papers and documents while I flitted around the house, doing anything to distract myself from the ache in my chest. The intimacy we'd shared the night before had been a dangerous crossing of boundaries, and now, in the cold light of day, it felt impossible to face him. When he finally emerged, he seemed different, subdued, almost skittish. His eyes met mine briefly before darting away, his usual confidence replaced with something closer to shame. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. I didn't want to talk. Talking would make it real, would force us to confront the reality of what we'd done. But I nodded anyway, following him into the living room, where the air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "What happened last night? It was wrong. I should have stopped it." I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "It wasn't just you," I said quietly. "I didn't stop it either." "Farther," he sighed, leaning back and running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what came over me. You're my son's wife, for God's sake. This can't happen again." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know." But even as we spoke the words, I could feel the pull between us, the lingering connection that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't just about the physical intimacy. It was about the way he'd seen me, really seen me in a way Richard hadn't in years. That kind of validation was intoxicating, and it scared me how much I craved it. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We spoke only when necessary, keeping our interactions polite but distant. It was exhausting, pretending that everything was fine when every glance, every accidental brush of fingers, brought back the memory of that night. In the evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence became unbearable, and she pointed to me with her large blue eyes. "How are things with Richard?" he asked suddenly, his voice carefully neutral. The question caught me off guard. "They're fine," I lied, though my tone betrayed me. He tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "Are they? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't seem like he's been the husband you deserve." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I'd spent so long convincing myself that Richard's distance was just a phase, that his long hours and lack of affection were the price of being married to a driven man. But the truth was, I felt more like a roommate than a wife, and the wife staring at Sabrina's pale face and gaunt features instead of being face to face with her. "It's not that simple," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Marriage is complicated." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Complicated doesn't mean you have to settle for being ignored." I looked away, unable to handle the intensity of his gaze. "Why are you saying this?" "Because I've seen it," he said softly. "I've seen how he takes you for granted, and I've seen how much you try to hide it. You deserve better." The weight of his words hung between us, and for a moment I felt the urge to reach for him, to let him pull me into his arms and tell me everything would be okay. But I didn't. I couldn't. The next morning, Richard called. His voice was warm, even cheerful, as though he had no idea that anything was wrong. He mentioned finishing a project earlier than expected and suggested he might come by to visit his father and me before his mother returned. The thought of him being here, in this house, with the lingering tension between his father and me, sent a wave of panic through me. "That's a great idea," I said, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "Your dad will be happy to see you." After I hung up, I found my father-in-law in the kitchen. "Richard's thinking of coming by," I said, trying to sound casual. He froze, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. "When?" "Tomorrow, maybe," I said. He didn't say for sure. His expression shifted, a flicker of unease passing over his face. "That's good. It'll be nice to see him." "Oh, yeah." But I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. The thought of Richard walking into this house, oblivious to the storm raging beneath the surface, was almost too much to bear. That evening I found myself wandering into his study. He looked up from his desk as I entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Where? Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. I hesitated, then crossed the room and sank into the chair across from him. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice breaking, "about Richard, about everything." He leaned back, his eyes heavy with empathy. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. But whatever happens, you can't let this eat away at you." I shook my head, tears brimming in my eyes. "It already is. I feel like I'm drowning." He reached across the desk, his hand covering mine. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear. I wanted to believe him, to let myself lean on him, but the guilt was too strong. I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. Uh, uh, I, 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 I felt more than hurt, as if his dark light were infesting my life and pouring thunders to my soul. I should go, I said, my voice trembling. Good night, he replied, his tone heavy with unspoken words. The following day, Richard arrived. His presence filled the house in a way that made the tension between his father and me even more unbearable. He greeted his father warmly, clapping him on the back, and kissed me on the cheek as though nothing had changed. My heart felt like it might just burst. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something. His eyes lingered on me longer than usual, and his questions about how I'd been spending my time felt pointed, almost accusatory. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, Richard made a casual remark that sent my heart racing. It's funny, he said, swirling his wine. Dad, you've always been so good at reading people. I bet you'd know if someone was keeping a secret. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. I glanced at his father. His expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. I think we all have secrets, his father replied evenly. The question is whether they're worth sharing. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. True. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. Richard's words had felt like a warning, a subtle acknowledgement that he suspected something. I glanced at the empty space beside me. He'd fallen asleep on the couch after too many glasses of wine, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. What had I done? And more importantly, how would I live with it? The morning dawned gray and heavy, the remnants of the storm lingering in the form of mist clinging to the windows. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that presses on you, demanding attention. I tiptoed downstairs, hoping to find a moment alone to clear my thoughts. But Richard was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee. Morning, he said, his tone casual. But his eyes, sharp and searching, told a different story. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile. My heart raced as I busied myself fixing a cup of tea, avoiding his gaze. I could feel his presence behind me, a tangible weight pressing against my back. You've been quiet, he said suddenly, his voice low. Everything okay? I nodded quickly, too quickly. Of course, just tired, I guess. Richard didn't respond immediately, but I could feel his eyes on me, as though he were trying to decipher a puzzle only he could see. Finally, he sighed and turned away, taking his coffee to the living room. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. The family dinner that evening was a strained affair. My mother-in-law had returned earlier in the day, her usual cheerful energy filling the house and masking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. She laughed and chatted, oblivious to the heavy silence that passed between her husband and me whenever our eyes met. Ugh! Richard, too, seemed different, more observant, more measured in his words. At one point, as we sat around the table, he turned to his father with a question that made my stomach drop. Dad, do you ever feel like people aren't honest with you? He asked, his tone light but laced with something darker. His father paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? I don't know, Richard said, shrugging. Just a thought. Sometimes I feel like people hide things because they think it'll protect someone. But secrets have a way of coming out, don't they? The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. My mother-in-law, blissfully unaware, chuckled and shook her head. Oh, Richard, you're always so dramatic. But I couldn't laugh. My throat was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced at my father-in-law, whose face was carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in his jaw. I suppose they do, he said finally, his voice even. Richard's gaze flicked to me for a moment, then back to his father. Good to know. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom under the guise of being tired. I couldn't face another moment of forced normalcy, of pretending that everything was fine. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain-streaked window, there was a knock on the door. I sat up, startled, my gun trembling. Come in, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It was my father-in-law. He closed the door quietly behind him and stood there, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. We're arrived later than that. I nodded, my chest tight. I know. He crossed the room, sitting in the chair by the window. For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes heavy with regret. I've made a mistake, he said finally. And I don't just mean what happened between us. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. There's something you should know about Richard. About Richard? I froze, the air leaving my lungs. What about him? He hesitated, as though weighing whether to continue. I've known for a while that he hasn't been faithful. I didn't want to interfere, but maybe I should have. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, struggling to process what he'd just said. What are you talking about? He's been seeing someone, he said quietly. I don't know all the details, but I've seen the signs, the late nights, the excuses. I didn't want to believe it, but my mind raced, fragments of memories and moments clicking into place, the distant behavior, the unexplained absences. It all made sense now, and yet I couldn't bring myself to feel anger. All I felt was a hollow sense of inevitability. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his tone heavy with regret. And maybe I was afraid of what it would mean for our family. Tears filled my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. So, what does that mean for us? For what happened? He shook his head, his expression pained. It doesn't change what we did. It doesn't make it right. But it makes it easier to justify, I said bitterly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He flinched, but he didn't argue. I hope you can find a way to forgive him. And yourself. The next day, Richard left early, citing an urgent work matter. My mother-in-law was bustling around the house, humming to herself as though nothing was wrong. And my father-in-law, he avoided me entirely. I spent most of the day in a daze, replaying everything he'd told me, everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. That evening, as I packed my things to leave, he finally approached me. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his eyes shadowed. I'm sorry, he said softly, for everything. E.A. I looked at him, my emotions a tangled mess. I don't know if I can forgive you, or myself. He nodded, as though he'd expected that. Just don't let this ruin you. You're stronger than you think. The words felt hollow, but I nodded anyway. Goodbye. Goodbye, he said, his voice breaking slightly. As I drove away from the house, the rain began to fall again, light and steady, washing away the remnants of the storm. I didn't know what the future held, whether I could confront Richard about his betrayal or if I could ever face his father again. But one thing was certain: the choices we make, the secrets we keep, they never truly stay buried. They linger, like ghosts, haunting the spaces we leave behind. And as I drove into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when the truth finally came out? And who would be left standing in its wake? My heart began to thump beats as I drove into my driveway next morning to greet the school bus. The next morning I woke up feeling no more rested than the night before. I made coffee, the familiar routine, offering a small measure of comfort, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the rising steam as though it held the answers I needed. I had to decide what to do. Confront Richard? Demand the truth? Or let it go and bury the past along with my own indiscretions? Before I could come to any conclusions, the doorbell rang. My heart lurched, irrationally hoping it might be Richard, that he had come home early. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Richard standing there. It was his father. He looked as exhausted as I felt, his shoulders slumped and his face lined with the weight of everything that had transpired. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, his voice low. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He moved past me into the living room, pausing by the mantel to look at the photos. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, not turning around. "So have I admitted, closing the door behind me. I didn't offer him coffee or a seat. I didn't trust myself to act like a proper host. "Why are you here?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Because I can't leave things like this. I need to know where we stand, what you're going to do." "What I'm going to do," I echoed, my voice tinged with disbelief. "You think this is my decision alone? That I'm the only one who has to live with this?" "And I'm not saying that," he said quickly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "But I need to know if you're going to tell Richard." "Are you going to tell Richard?" Noah nodded. I froze, the question catching me off guard. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. The idea of telling Richard the truth felt impossible, and yet the thought of carrying this secret, of living with the weight of it for the rest of my life, was equally unbearable. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "What do you want me to do? Do you want me to tell him? Do you think that would fix this?" "No," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "I don't think it would fix anything. But he deserves the truth, doesn't he? We both know he hasn't been honest with you either." The truth came out painfully, and finally it outweighed the hurt. The words cut deep, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "You think that makes it better? That because he's been unfaithful, it somehow justifies what we did?" "No," he said again, stepping closer. "Nothing justifies what we did, but I can't go back and change it, and I can't keep pretending it didn't happen. So you walk back to yourself. You're free. You're safe. You're safe." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Neither can I. The conversation ended without resolution. He left shortly after, his shoulders heavy with the same burden I carried. I watched him walk down the driveway and climb into his car, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. When he was gone, I closed the door and leaned against it, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I could confront Richard, if I could forgive him or myself. The choices we'd made, the secrets we'd kept, had fractured everything. And yet, life would go on, the sun would rise and set, the days would blur into weeks, and the weight of this secret would settle into the spaces between us, invisible but always present. A week later, Richard came home. He was cheerful, his arms filled with flowers and takeout from my favorite restaurant. He kissed me on the cheek and told me he'd missed me. His smile so genuine, it made my stomach churn. As we sat down to eat, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I know things have been hard lately," he said, his tone earnest. "But I want to fix that. I want to make things better." I stared at him, his words swirling in my mind. Did he mean them? Or was this just another layer of the facade we'd both been living behind? I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall back into the comfort of our routine, but the truth sat between us like an unwelcome guest. "I want that too," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, his grip on my hand tightening. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." I nodded, forcing a smile in return, but as we continued eating, his words echoed in my mind. Together. Did he really mean it? Or was he just as lost as I was, clinging to the illusion of a life that had already begun to unravel? That night, as I lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew one thing for certain. The choices we make, the secrets we keep, they don't disappear. They linger, shaping us, changing us in ways we can't always see. And no matter how much we try to move forward, the past is always there, a shadow just beyond the edge of the light.